And now for the main feature of tonight, the open lecture, to be presented by Professor Alan Davison, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney. He's going to be speaking to us about challenges for open inquiry and scholarship in a divided age. Alan has an unusual educational background, being largely homeschooled and entering university via special admissions. He studied piano privately through his teenage years before initially undertaking a Bachelor of Music in Performance and then changing to musicology and ethnomusicology when he permanently injured his hands. I'm sure there's a story behind that, Alan. My medical interest is tweaked. While being homeschooled in his teens, Alan pursued multiple passions, including philosophy, art history, music, and zoology. Studies of zoology led him to publish his first paper in a peer-reviewed journal, Australian Mammalogy, when he was in his mid-teens, an impressive record before he even got to university. Alan's current research interests mainly cover music and visual culture, art and aesthetics, celebrity studies, and 19th century European cultural history. He maintains his knowledge of his previous interests, especially in the philosophy of science and the scientific method. Recently, Alan has actively promoted viewpoint diversity within our academic communities as the lead of Heterodox Academy in Australia, and has published both scholarly and popular articles on trends in social sciences and humanities research. In late 2021, Alan partnered with well-known media figure Josh Zapps to launch the Permission to Think speaker series. This series invites prominent scholars to look at the role of intellectuals and institutions during this age of outrage in public debate of complex issues, especially in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. To date, guests in this series have included the likes of John Haidt and Alice Drager. Alan, welcome to this virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that lovely, generous introduction. And hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure and an honour to be here. And I'd like to thank the Royal Society of New South Wales for the invitation. So hello, everyone. It's absolutely a great pleasure to be here. And I hope this is an interesting and stimulating talk for you live watching now and in the future on YouTube. I hope it has some value. So I'd like to talk, as Susan said, about what I feel are the challenges for open inquiry and scholarship in this particularly fragmented time, and in particular focus on the challenges that I believe the HASS, the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences disciplines, have in dealing with this. So the structure today is reasonably straightforward. I've got a proposition and a provocation, especially relating to challenges within the HASS sector. Asking the obvious question, is there even a problem to be worried about? Should we be concerned? And I'll take quite a bit of time working my way through that, because in looking at what I believe the case may be that there is actually a challenge for us in the HASS sector and why we have that challenge, it will also lead very nicely, I think, into the section on what are the drivers behind this challenge? What are the incentives? What are the disincentives? Then I'll look at some of the responses that we're seeing globally and more locally, focusing eventually on what's happening here in Australia, but spending a bit of time looking at what happens overseas, and then conclude with a few thoughts, and then, of course, look forward to questions and working our way through these things. So just to position ourselves, here's a reasonably, I think, uncontroversial statement, characteristics of a research university. This is from the Global Research Universities, the HEFEI statement on research universities, which is a reasonably fulsome document, but I want to pull out just a few key points here just to situate what's going to come later. So this includes the group of 8. but also many other fine universities and consortiums globally. So point 5 is a dedication to the highest standards of research and research integrity, and of course its ethical obligations, which I've highlighted there. Point 6 is the responsible exercise of academic freedom by faculty, and by faculty that's of course in the American use of the word, by academic staff, by scholars, and in particular based on and founded upon open inquiry and continued testing of current understanding. And then critically for the culture of this academic inquiry is point 7, a tolerance, recognition, and welcoming of competing views, perspectives, frameworks, and positions as being necessary to support progress, along with a commitment to civil debate and discussion. Now, of course, the university's critical role here is not only having that opportunity to have competing views, perspectives, frameworks, but also, of course, in modelling for wider society, the platform and the way to have those discussions and debates is critically important as well. So here's the question, which was the basis of the talk. Are the current settings within the ecosystem of academia, such as career incentives, social media, public discourse, optimal for generating the best research we can in our universities? So I have a thesis. It's probably overblown to call it a thesis. Let's call it a proposition that the HAS disciplines, based on their academic cohort, the areas and the topics they tend to research, and the methodologies and tools they tend to use, are particularly prone to a series of negative influences and incentives upon the key scholarly mission. And in fact, we have a very delicate ecosystem within the university sector more generally, but I would say especially so within humanities, arts, and social sciences. So moving from that, if you like, proposition or thesis, I'd like to move to a provocation. The provocation is that in the current environment, and certainly in the last few years, moral clarity is now one of the most dominant drivers in HAS scholarship, to the extent that it might even be over and above the fundamental scholarly mission, especially so in fraught social, political, and ideological areas. So it could be race, religion, gender, climate change, etc. So perhaps a not very precise way of describing it is there's a lot of underdetermined explanations of social issues driven by an overdetermined moralistic attitude or driver. I'll unpack that as we progress to see if it makes sense and see if it's convincing for you. So let's spend a little bit of time discussing, is there even a problem to be concerned about? So for those of you that follow Times Higher Education and John Ross, who you'll know writes extensively on the state of academia in the region, not just Australia, here are two recent pieces based on the same fundamental piece of work. One from his weekly newsletter, which is on the right-hand side where I've cut and pasted. The other one is a quote from his Times Higher Education full piece. So on the left, this is a recent survey done by the Academic Freedom Society of New South Wales and the Free Speech Union. And almost half of academics did not feel at liberty to argue against the consensus with their colleagues. And barely 2 in 5 felt comfortable discussing hot button issues such as colonialism in a country where their right to do so is enshrined in law. Further down, 50% are comfortable discussing sex and gender, with 45% comfortable discussing race. Now, he fleshes that out in the more extensive piece on the right-hand side, you can see there, also referring to this survey by the New Zealand Free Speech Union. And he calls out a few things that are obviously going to be objections. He mentions in that second paragraph, such academic freedom surveys, not just here in our region, but globally, tend to get shrugged off as right-wing problems, if you like, Fox News, Sky News, etc. But he mentions there, in my experience, concerns about freedom of expression traverse the political spectrum. And anyway, arguments should be considered on their merits, not on the personal characteristics of their proponents. An excellent point. Now, because John is very well connected, the next couple of sentences I feel are really pertinent. Nervousness about discussing race and gender also traverses the academic hierarchy. So this is him speaking, not just based on the survey. I'll go on. Vice-chancellors and their deputies won't go there until they've triple-checked that they're off the record, and even then they're pretty guarded. So this is John's own views. So jumping down to the last paragraph before I move on. Maybe the FSU, that's the Free Speech Union, skeptics are right. Maybe it's just a handful of right-wingers banging on about cancel culture. Why not do some proper, officially sanctioned research and find out, is how he concludes. So let's bear that in mind and have a slightly broader afield look at these issues of academic freedom and touching on issues of cancel culture and what he calls here the hot button issues. So in America, there's the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, known as FIRE, which does an enormous amount of work. It's apolitical, and it's basically looking at freedom of speech from an American perspective. And there was a survey from last year, and I'll read out the key conclusions. A majority of faculty worry about losing their jobs or reputations because someone misrepresents their words. A third self-censor out of concern over the responses of staff, students, or administrators. Moreover, a significant portion of faculty support punishing their colleagues in softer ways that can chill expression. This summary concludes by saying the academic freedom glass is at best half full. And that's from, I put the screenshot there, and I'm happy to provide any links, of course, to Guy or Lewis afterwards, so listeners and viewers can follow up. So let's move aside from the issue of academic freedom and potentially cancel culture, noting those 2 points, and ask the question, are there other things going on that might count against freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression, academic expression in particular, on the university campus and in the university sector overall? And another issue emerges in the literature is that of siloing and insularity of disciplines. Now, of course, in the HAS sector, we have multiple disciplines within them. So even within social sciences, there's a multitude of disciplines and subdisciplines, same for arts and same for humanities. But that does create certain types of challenges when we have a discipline that makes claims about matters that go beyond only its remit. So in other words, how does a discipline that makes claims about human social behavior, politics, things like that, if that discipline doesn't engage with other disciplines that also make claims or have insights into human behavior, social behavior, et cetera, how do we try to reconcile them? And there's a very well cited, I think it's had over 30,000 views as well, piece by Charlotta Stern, who's professor of sociology at Stockholm University. And she wrote a piece a few years ago now, but I think it's still very pertinent. And it's called Undoing Insularity, a small study of gender sociology's big problem. And the key point I want to highlight that Professor Stern points out here is that gender sociology is just one example. She could have chosen others, but it's one where its research and its arguments, of course, pertain to a whole lot of other disciplines that talk about human behavior, sex differences, etc. So she says here, in my experience as a sociologist, I see many ways in which gender sociology tends to insulate itself from challenging its own sacred beliefs and sacred causes. The sacred beliefs are to the effect that the biological differences between sexes are minor, and that cultural differences between the genders have little basis in biological differences. She then goes on to point out that there's a whole lot of areas and disciplines that have also something to say on this matter. She concludes by saying in this extract, "It saddens me to see students and scholars fall into insular communities of highly dubious sacred beliefs and causes. I propose that gender sociologists strive to undo insularity." Now, it doesn't have to be gender sociology. It could be any one of other areas. But this challenge of insularity in a broad cluster of fields like humanities, arts, and social sciences is very much an ongoing challenge, and especially problematic when particular narrow fields make truth claims about a wide range of things relating to human behavior, social behavior, politics, etc., when in fact there's many other fields that make competing claims. So insularity can often be a very significant challenge in our areas. So going on, is there even a problem? Here's another paper from 2018, looking at psychological barriers to evolutionary psychology. Now, I won't go through all of these quotes in detail, but just to point out, the point that Buss and von Hippel are making here, who are the authors, is that the ideological and political orientation of social psychologists, just moving around the fields a little bit, is heavily politically skewed. And as a result, what tends to come with that political and ideological perspective is a series of assumptions about human nature, human behavior, put crudely, the blank slate idea. So what they're pointing out here is a little bit the same, that there's a lack of interest at times in engaging with other disciplines that also have something to say, or indeed even a lack of acknowledgement of something as fundamental as the blank slate notion, because ideological or political bias may very much anchor someone to a view that's either on one end of the spectrum or the other. And this is without, of course, being a biological determinist. Now, I've quoted a couple of people that you could say are sort of on the outside of this sort of challenges, looking in and making commentary about it. But here's an example of someone, this is Isaac Gottsman, who wrote a very comprehensive history and intellectual history of the critical turn in education. This is a really, really significant book that it basically traces the critical approach in education theory, education praxis over many decades through the 20th century into the 21st century. And he is very much, if you like, part of that critical theory community. And this is from his opening chapter. To the question, where did all the 60s radicals go? And he's quoting someone here, the most accurate answer would be neither to religious cults nor to yuppiedom, but to the classroom. Now, the point he's making here is that with Marxist and post-Marxist critical thinking, and I quote, as participants in the radical politics of the 60s entered graduate school and moved into faculty positions and started publishing, the critical turn began to change scholarship throughout the humanities and social sciences. The field of education was no exception. Just reading out the bold pieces, the turn to critical Marxist thought is a defining moment in the past 40 years of educational scholarship. Initially sequestered into curriculum studies and the sociology of education, today critical scholarship is frequently published in the journals of some of the field's most historically conservative areas, such as educational administration and science education. The critical turn radicalized the field. Now, what's interesting here, this is very much from someone who is in the, if you like, post-Marxist or neo-Marxist critical tradition, talking quite openly about how a certain set of perspectives viewed through Marxist or neo-Marxist lenses has come to dominate certainly some fields and certainly the education field. So I think we need to be careful when when a right-wing politician or on Fox News, they talk about Marxist radical academics, and we say, no, they're not. That's just right-wings bangers on. Sometimes the academics themselves admit they're very happy to identify themselves as Marxist academics. Now, moving on a little bit further in the book into his conclusions. And here I want to pull out two things, because I think Gottsman has the perception to see that there's challenges within the isolation that tends to come from the Marxist or the post-Marxist approach, the critical approach that he's talking about. So he says he's excited by all the recent scholarship, etc. And I'll quote now, too often critical scholarship is poorly crafted from thin readings of ideas to shoddy polemical pronouncements. We cannot continue to simply slap the label critical on our scholarship and call it good. Part of the problem of insularity is that we tend to read very deeply in our own scholarly community. End of the quotes. So you can see here, even from someone from within a domain who's very much part of that domain of post-Marxist critical turn, if you like, within education, he's calling out some of the challenges. And it does raise the issue, and he says here, we can't slap the label critical on our scholarship and call it good. And he's hinting at here at something that I think other scholars and commentators that I'll turn to in just a moment have picked up with a little bit more alacrity, and that is by using the critical turn or labeling it as critical. A, does that tend to overblow the claims that can be made through that scholarship? But B, and more concerningly, does it tend to insulate that scholarship from critique or make it harder to critique? But I'd like you just to hold that thought as we look at someone who is much more openly critical. And that is Lee Jussom, who's the Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Rutgers University. He's written quite vehemently on what he sees some of the challenges in social sciences, social psychology especially, which is his field, but he talks much more generally about other areas as well. And I'm very proud to say he was on our Permission to Think series interviewed by Josh, which you'll be able to find online. And here I want to raise the issue of moral certainty versus epistemic uncertainty, but also importantly, the cohort politically and ideologically that tends to make up some discipline areas. So on the left-hand side, there's an essay he wrote that's up online, The Radicalization of the American Academy. The subtitle, you can make many bizarre claims in academia if you frame them as advancing social justice. Picking up but making much more trenchant the point that's been made before, that by putting the critical piece in or the social justice piece in, does that enhance or does it insulate the claims being made from critique? And what he proposes, slightly tongue-in-cheek, I think, but it's an interesting model, is an activist to academia to activism pipeline. And he points out, and I'll show some data in a minute that does confirm this much, in general, and in the HAS sector especially, and in social sciences more generally, I suppose, people who are attracted to those fields tend to be from a little bit more from the left. And we're talking mainly American cohort, that's his sample. So there tends to be an element of self-selection of people going into academia to even undertake studies in these areas to start with. Once there, we have all of the incentives and disincentives to get ahead. So what you're going to do, the work environment you're in, the kinds of scholarships, funding, projects that you can get funded for, etc. And then things come out the other end. Now, to put that into words, perhaps is a little bit more convincing than the diagram, although the diagram's nice. He calls this the pipeline model. The pipeline model suggests the existence of distributed coordination, not in a mustachio-twirling villains spinning conspiracies in dark basement sort of way, but in a we are all happily living in the same bubble sort of way, between the political far left, academia, and mass media. Left media can refer to scholarship that reflects the axe-grinding ideologies of those who produce it far more than it reflects anything that is actually true, thereby creating the impression that left-affirming claims have more credibility than they deserve. Now, this is a much more stringent form of something, though, that Gottsman had pointed out, that there is a lot of work done, a lot of research coming out that leverages the critical mindset, particularly with a post or neo-Marxist framework. And it is really sometimes quite hard to challenge it, sometimes on the basis of the moral issues of what you get accused of if you do challenge the research. That's basically what Justin was saying. Let's have a look at some of the split of the demographics in academia. On the right is a couple of surveys done 8 years apart. And again, this is US faculty, US academia. And we can see that there's various categories called radical, activist, Marxist, and socialist. Now, they're not overly robust because the surveys were undertaken slightly differently. They are broad categories, but we'll use it just as an indication. We can see there that collectively, the radical, activist, Marxist, and socialist academics, or at least one of them, makes up quite a significant number of those in academia, and particularly in those fields of humanities, arts, and social sciences that they tend to focus on. Now, this is in America, I should stress. This is not Australian data, and there will be some significant margin of error around this. But the point, irrespective of the precise figures, is there's a certain type of person, certain type of intellect, certain type of person of a political bearing that might be attracted to certain types of discipline areas. And that makes perfect sense, of course, because they're attracted to them. However, to what extent, if you like, is the baggage of a series of ideological or political viewpoints that are already very strongly established get carried through and channeled through academic work, as opposed to perhaps being challenged by that academic work. Now, even so, let's say for the sake of arguments, this was the case, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that academics undertaking research in sociology, social science, or whatever it happens to be, doesn't matter they've got a series of political and ideological perspectives, because at the end of the day, the research, they should be asking questions with an open mind and they should be undertaking rigorous research. So let's have a look at whether it does matter or not. So let's look at what might be called academic activism. The idea that, which I think is quite normalized now, that academics are doing work to change the world. And I think we would agree that nearly everyone doing in academia, whether it's a medical researcher, cancer research, environmental research, everybody wants to make the world a better place. The challenge is, I think, when we get what we might call an academic mindset. An academic mindset is where there's a view that you've already got pretty much a predetermined view of what reality needs to be, and therefore things are turned on their head. So here's a lovely little essay by Thomas Wells, who's at the Leiden Institute of Philosophy. Nice little essay that's online on his blog called The Philosopher's Beard, and he is a philosopher, called Academics Should Not Be Activists. And the point that he makes is, and I'll quote here, activism has a pernicious effect on academic integrity because it stands the normal order of business on its head. The activist begins with the correct conclusion and then works backwards to find the evidence that would justify it, while finding excuses to dismiss criticism and counter evidence. Obviously, that's a rather bald way of saying it, but nonetheless, the point is, what is the relationship between having a preset series of notions that might come from a Marxist perspective, might come from a libertarian perspective, might come from various political perspectives that one is thoroughly ingrained in? How does entering academia and gaining the tools of academia either challenge those, or does it become a conduit for those? So in Wells's case, he problematizes, if I can use a very common word now, academic activism. Now, there's a lot of research and a lot of commentary on academic activism, many for it, and some against it. But I think the challenge here is that it's good to be having these discussions still, and it's good to know that there's a variety of different people asking questions about activism in academia and what its manifestations might be, and whether it's fine or whether it's not fine. So, does it matter? Do the assumptions that an academic might have coming into the social sciences perhaps rather insulated from other domains of knowledge that might pertain to their area, and perhaps having a very strong set of ideological and political perspectives that they believe to be, if you like, true? Well, here's two examples. On the left, we've got Lorne Dawson, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Waterloo in Canada, a very, very distinguished sociologist of religion. And in recent years, this is 2018, but he's published several papers to point out as this paper is called here, the curious erasure of religion from the study of religious terrorism. Because it's very much the norm now to make the statement that religious beliefs have very little to do with terrorism and violence. It's a disconnect. And yet, Lorne, who's actually gone and researched and talked to terrorists themselves, makes the point that this is actually more of a moral preposition, that there cannot be a relationship between religious beliefs and religious terrorism than actually being based in research. And so he spent quite a few years recently, and this is his area of expertise, the sociology of religion, pointing out the obvious, if rather awkward thing, that there may indeed be a relationship of some kind, possibly quite complex, between the nature of religious beliefs and the adherence to those religious beliefs and religiously inspired terrorist acts. So it's more a matter of not avoiding the politically or socially awkward conversation. Is it a matter of fact or not? And on the right-hand side, we have Simon Cotty, who's Senior Lecturer of Criminology from the University of Kent. This was a few years ago, again pointing out that a lot of the work that's been done in criminology and counter-extremism, particularly in the UK, has been led by a certain series of what you might call liberal ideological assumptions that would deny the very existence between any connection of religious beliefs and violence. And again, he's pointing out the same thing. So what I'm doing by giving these examples is it is not always a trivial matter whether some things are off the table, if you like, to investigate, because they can sometimes be morally or ethically challenging to investigate. If they're matters of fact, potentially or not, we need to be very aware about how the dispositions of scholars in certain fields can tend to lead them to ignore or avoid certain types of awkward questions. So is there really a problem in academia, and is there a problem with free speech? Now, again, just to give you an example and a taste that concerns about free speech and inquiry are not just coming from, if you like, right-wing conservatives or reactionaries. This is from a recent issue from last year of the journal Feminist Dissent. And you couldn't get much more classic left-wing based rights than this. And in its introduction, the three authors are very well-known feminist campaigners in the UK, particularly for multicultural women's rights, point out that there's a deepening crisis now, not only in totalitarian states, but especially and very concerningly in democratic states, amongst left-wing as well as right-wing, that free speech is especially under attack, and it really pertains to the types of work that they need to do, which looks at the oppression of women within certain cultural communities, underage marriage, FGM, etc. Now, because the political leanings of many people that research these areas means there's a tendency to avoid often asking difficult questions, so that people in certain communities that are already marginalized get further marginalized because sometimes it's hard to have the discussion. Here's another example. So this is taken as part of, as some of you may have heard, the major review that was commissioned by the NHS in the UK into gender identity services, or GIDS, known as the Cass Review, led by Hilary Cass, who was the former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. And there's the link on the right-hand side to the Cass Review. On the left-hand side is some preliminary work that was done by a consultancy group of over 100 health workers, either primary or secondary, that work with children and young people, that's the CYP, who exhibit gender questioning or gender dysphoria behaviour. And the results of this, again, point out some really interesting things. So the participants were asked to really highlight what are the things that are making this work challenging for you. And there's a multitude, resourcing, all kinds of other things. But several really concerning things come out, and I've highlighted some. To call out one, policies and approaches in educational institutions, medical services, and society more broadly are perceived to be based on ideologies and not evidence. This is one of the recurring themes from these primary and secondary workers. Another point, fear of reprisals for professionals who take on a more exploratory approach to supporting children and young people. And then another one, lack of longer-term evidence of the effects of medical interventions such as puberty blockers and hormone treatment. So this is coming directly from the primary and secondary healthcare workers who work with children and young people exhibiting gender questioning or gender dysphoric symptoms, if you like. Now, the challenge and what I'd posed to you on the call and elsewhere is, as an academic, and as an academic interested in matters around gender, childhood development, whatever, where can we have these conversations? What young academics, certainly at a university, would feel comfortable raising concerns that the healthcare workers themselves are raising anonymously in this kind of work as part of a major review? So this idea of it's very hard to have full and frank discussions about socially, ideologically fraught matters. And really the only place that they can occur is within universities themselves, because if we're not laying the foundation of these kinds of conversations, it's going to be very hard to progress. I'll give one more example and then we're going to push on. An example a bit more close to home is, of course, the dark emu phenomenon. And this is from a piece in 2021 when Peter Sutton, leading anthropologist, and Karen Welsh, I think the name is, published a major piece of work, scholarly piece of work, that challenged a lot of the suppositions made, claims made in Bruce Pascoe's book, Dark Emu. This is his interview with the Sydney Morning Herald, I think as part of the Good Weekend magazine. And I quote, "Wondering why Dark Emu was so well received, Sutton and Walsh write that its success appears to indicate a profound lack of knowledge about Aboriginal people and history, or an unconcern with facts and truth themselves." What's particularly concerning, and that Sutton goes on to talk about, is that the media, who were so smitten with Dark Emu when it came out and gave it a roaring success in its reception and its sales, hardly any journalist actually reached out to specialists in anthropology, archaeology, history, or indeed even Indigenous elders and authorities themselves to actually ask questions about the validity of the claims that were being made. So he points out here, nor do members of the media appear to have spoken to any of the anthropological specialists who have learned from Aboriginal authorities and from the vast literature on their traditional ways of life. This journalistic abandonment of the academy, if that's what it is, seems to be symptomatic of a break from the past. The authority of the academy has slipped. Now, it's an interesting observation from a really esteemed anthropologist. But what's also concerning is, imagine the scenario where even if a journalist had reached out to an academic prior to this book, Sutton and Walsh's book, coming out, what academics do we feel, particularly young emerging academics in anthropology, history, archaeology, who would have been comfortable expressing any concerns about the book? Again, it seems to be a moral prerogative that's pushing a lot of the debate rather than an actual, if you like, dispassionate look at what's going on. All right, I'm going to move on. So let's look at the drivers. I hope by looking at some examples there of, is there even a problem, does raise a few points about what are the drivers that might be leading to this, and is there something going on? So firstly, let's look at the external environment, which I think HASS disciplines have always struggled under. In our country and in others, there's often an economic prerogative, there's often a skills prerogative narrowly defined regarding technology and functionality in the workplace. Of course, we had the Work Ready Graduates program that's still with us now. So I think the HASS side of things is often finding itself very much under the boot of a whole lot of governmental policy and economic imperatives that make it really hard to sort of get our proper voice. On top of that, particularly with social media, we're often dealing with or investigating or dabbling in topics that are hot topics, these hot button topics of the type I've cited a few examples of. And with the amount of people on social media, or apparently on social media, getting outraged, it's obviously an area that it's really challenging for us. On top of that, there is the massification and standardization of the academy. So it's not just a problem. This is something that means that universities, not just within the country, but a lot around the globe are sort of facing the same kinds of problems structurally. And for those of us within HASS who have looked at the way funding has gone towards the STEM disciplines versus the HASS disciplines, we often feel that we've really got to push and headline the kinds of work that we do in order to get, some appearance out there, in order to get some traction. Internally, as I pointed out in the examples that I've given, we have, I think, a serious challenge of the siloing of subdisciplines and disciplines, and sometimes a lack of engagement with other disciplines that have something to say. And especially so where there's a multidisciplinary element to that. Potentially also internally as a driver is the ideological and political conformity, even orthodoxy, and even worse, tribalism that can exist within academic communities themselves, which makes dissent sometimes very hard to entertain, and it often gets dealt with quite harshly. So the whole idea of delegitimizing dissent, or if I can even say pathologizing debate, makes it quite hard. Final point is around the moralism of everything, because we're often dealing with topics that are very pertinent to the human condition, to people who are oppressed, underrepresented, and with gaps between the kinds of lifestyles and aspirations that many of us have and they miss out on. So it's always going to be a highly fraught and emotionally fraught area. But this makes it, I think, even more challenging. So let's look at some of the drivers. Now, again, most of the work that's done in the drivers is looking at overseas, and particularly polarization. Political polarization is really challenging. And I'd really commend to you the terrific work that a group called More in Common does. I put up the link there, and they do a lot of work surveying on the perception gap. So here's one. It's a few years old now, but as you can imagine, things have only got worse, not better. But this is the one that I had available. And it's looking at the differences of perceptions of Democrats and Republicans about each other. And basically what it finds is that either on the left or the right, those on one side imagine the views of the others to be much more extreme than they really are. And there's actually much more commonality and overlap, what they call the exhausted middle. Interestingly, though, there's a few key points they pull out. That higher education amongst Democrats corresponds with a higher perception gap. Interestingly, Democrats who hold a postgraduate degree are 3 times as inaccurate as those that did not graduate high school. This is in the misrepresentation of what they think people on the other side of the spectrum actually think. Also, the stronger or wider the perception gap at either end, the right or the left, tends to attribute negative personal qualities, hateful, spiteful, brainwashed, phobic, extremist, etc. The point is, through this survey work that More in Common does is, and I quote here, overall, Americans' view are more similar to their political opponents than they realise. But unfortunately, this just doesn't cut through. So the polarisation is more imagined than real, but because it's so prominent, in a way, it does make it real. So it makes it hard to cover any kind of politically controversial issue. And I just commend 2 pieces here, particularly the one on the right, which is an extensive 4-part investigation published by the Columbia Journalism Review, very esteemed and well-regarded journal, looking at the media coverage of Trump, and particularly the claims of Russian collusion, etc. at the time, and coming up with quite a critical view of how much of the mainstream media covered it. But because it was Trump, nobody seems to care too much whether the media's reporting was accurate or not, because it was Trump. But one could argue that's not really the point. I'll pass through this one. Now, one of the most significant commentators that has called out this, of course, is John Haidt. John Haidt's professor of moral psychology. And he's also been a guest on Permission to Think. And he calls it out in this way, and that is, what is the goal of the university? What is its purpose? What is its reason for existence? What is its telos? And he argues that universities in general have lost their commitment. They have lost their telos for the idea of truth, however precisely conceived. Instead, we have now a telos regarding a whole range of other things, social equity, diversity, social justice, etc. Now, if I read out a bit of the quote, some social scientists seem to believe that the telos of the social sciences is to bring about racial and gender equality. These may be noble goals, but elevating a quality of outcome to the level of a telos, sacralizing it, and then prohibiting trade-offs means that social scientists will sometimes have to sacrifice, hide, or ignore the truth, and they will inevitably end up punishing individual members for saying true things. So that's the way that John Haidt tries to characterize what's going on here. So he's at the Stern School of Business, by the way, New York University, and you may be familiar with some of his texts. He's written a few pieces. He's got a new book coming out. He's written a lot around moral psychology, and his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, is probably the most recent, the one that we might be familiar with. So I'll pass through these because I don't want to run out of time. So HASS, I think, is particularly susceptible to these kinds of things because of who we tend to be as an intellectual community, and what we tend to study. So therefore, avoiding those traps of insularity, of moralism, and of others is absolutely critical. And there's not like there's a shortage of really interesting and insightful research about the advocacy approach or a very highly moralistically driven approach or advocacy research. Here's just one example by Greg Mitchell. And he talks about one of the challenges of coming to an understanding of the construct validity or the external validity of a lot of social science work and psychology work especially. And the thing that prompted me to think of when I was reading through his paper again recently is there was a web page up for a while, I'm not sure if it's still there, called In Mice Only. And it was talking about studies that had sensational headlines about the results of, dietary change, environmental change, drugs or whatever, and what its potential could be for benefiting the human condition. But then you'd find out at the end of the article or somewhere in the media piece written about it, it was in mice only. And I think that we need to start getting to the point in some social science research, when we need to say in critical Marxist theory only, because unless you accept the precepts and the construction of the methodology and the assumptions behind the research, then the whole thing simply falls over. And yet when we see media coverage of a lot of research that's done in humanities, arts and social sciences, most journalists, of course, are not well enough equipped to ask, so explain to me the post-Marxist critical approach that you're using here, and how does it have external validity? No one's going to ask that. And yet it tends to be very dominant in some areas of research. As we saw in critical education research especially, it's probably one of the most dominant drivers. So I want to push on. What are the responses to all this going on? Well, there's quite a lot. So here's just a few examples that might be new to some of you, might not. Edinburgh University has University of Edinburgh Academics for Academic Freedom. I'll give them a link there. There's, of course, Heterox Academy that was co-founded by John Haidt a few years ago now in America. We've got the Free Speech Union, which started in the UK but is now in New Zealand. They're doing a lot of very interesting work. And we've got FIRE, which I've already mentioned. We've also got some really interesting developments happening globally as well, and one of which is the Society for Open Inquiry in Behavioural Science, and they run a wonderful online journal. The other thing we have is an association for academic freedom in Germany. There's a network there, linked there. So there's lots of really interesting things happening globally where communities of scholars across multiple disciplines are getting together to try to push back or challenge some of the orthodoxies we're seeing a lot of now in our academic work, and especially in arts, humanities and social sciences. So what's happening here in Australia? Well, I'd commend to everyone on the call the wonderful work that Jeff Sharrock does he's down in Melbourne, and he's done a lot of work on how to enlighten up, as he calls it, how to provide tools for lecturers and pedagogues, tutors, teachers, what they can do to help develop an environment that encourages open debate in a safe environment in the classroom or online, and how to equip each other with the skills to hear viewpoints and perspectives that we might find challenging. That's one thing. On the right here, we've got the series that I set up with Josh Sepps that Susan very kindly mentioned at the beginning. And there's just one example. There's Corey Clark. And we also have our own Heterox Australia branch, which is basically an online forum as well. So there are things happening around the world and locally where concerned academics of whatever disciplinary background, but concerned academics that are worried about some of the ways that public debate and the platform within which we try to have discussions about difficult things are managed or not managed. So to conclude, and then to move on to questions. I used to think very pessimistically that the long tradition of the universities being a place that welcomed free and open inquiry was degrading. But in fact, a dear friend of mine pointed out, actually, this used to be the case with universities hundreds of years ago anyway. They were there to basically indoctrinate students into the religious orthodoxy that bore their foundation. So are we just cycling back perhaps to an environment where there's orthodoxies and ideologies that are again dominant? And in fact, the blip that we've been benefiting from through, let's say, most of the 20th century was actually a blip, and the universities are returning to their natural state. That's a very pessimistic view, but I'll put it out there. How can we find out more about, is this actually a problem? Do we need to be doing surveys, perhaps anonymous, of academic staff, asking them how comfortable do you feel discussing things? If we were going to do that, who would we ask to do it? What's the role of academics? Even those, or especially those that might be in the orthodoxy themselves, but are interested to know, hang on, I'd like to have different viewpoints and perspectives, and I'd actually encourage them within my discipline, my school, my community. And finally, what's the role of university leaders? And I think the challenge is, this is from vice chancellors down to deans, such as myself, deputy vice chancellors. I think this is the really challenging one. When push comes to shove, I'm sure most vice chancellors would say, at our institution, we're committed to freedom of academic inquiry, etc. And they'll point to the odd circumstance where they've had a controversial speaker or a controversial lecturer, and they've ensured that that lecture goes ahead, they've provided security, and they've got the angry protesters out of the way. The problem is they are high-profile cases that look like demonstrations of a commitment to academic inquiry and open inquiry, but I suspect they're not really. I suspect they're a bit of a red herring. Because really what I've been talking about in the last 40 so minutes or so, a lot of this is about self-censorship. It's a lot about the way there's incentives to not even engage in difficult conversations, difficult topics, or coming out with uncomfortable truths. And it seems to me that in order to demonstrate that we have an academic environment, an institutional environment where that exists, we need to do more than just offering the odd security escort for a controversial speaker coming onto our campus. Thank you very much.
Alan, thank you for a fantastic talk, very thought-provoking. And it is a pleasure for me to be here tonight to address or curate the Q&A session here. So we'll start. We do have some questions in the Q&A bar, and I'd encourage anybody who has questions to pop those in there. Alan, our first question. With the constraint on Steam and the aspects of social media, are these factors potentially being engineered, whether this be nation state or even some of the fractional groups also exacerbating the ability to drive independent research when burdened by some of the concerns highlighted?
Short answer, yes, that sounds like a very, very reasonable proposition. And I think something to reiterate, and Lee Justin points out, there doesn't necessarily have to be anything conspiratorial about this. There's just a whole lot of things working together that make this kinds of debate and the various actions of interest groups, the various platforms involved, all of those things are working in concert, even if they're not really intending to work in concert, to make this kind of, having this kind of frank and open debate very difficult.
Okay. And our next question is, the left and right both exaggerate, but in different ways. The right often view the left as uninformed and naive. The left often view the right as morally inferior and evil. One of these positions is more dangerous than the other. What are your thoughts?
Quite possibly. If all things taken equally, it could well be that if one perspective came to dominate our institutions, especially, and our discourse more generally, it could be incredibly dangerous. And I remember Christopher Hitchens being asked, why is he particularly focused on a certain type of religious group at the moment? And he pointed out, well, in the 1930s, I would have been talking about the Catholic Church. So I think one of these things is the response needs to be measured and nuanced to the particularities of how the problem manifests, rather than generalizing, pushing the right against the left rhetoric. And there is a danger, because, and it's certainly the case in several of the examples I gave today and a lot of the discussion I have with colleagues that share concerns, a lot of this is seen to be a sort of a thing that's coming from a certain element of the left. But if you think about the horseshoe theory, at times the censoriousness and moralizing that comes from some elements of the left reads very similar to me to some of the censoriousness that typically has come from the right. And that could well be a new and emerging element. Lack of tolerance on the left that's traditionally been much more tolerant and open-minded. We're seeing manifestations, in my view, of a really unpleasant intolerance in the so-called progressive left that speaks more of what would have been in the past a sort of right-wing censoriousness.
Right. And our next question speaks to, and I think and I was also very pleased to see about you're talking about the role of university administrators, who often will come from one particular political background. Where do you see a solution?
Yes, well, the purpose of the talk was try to outline the case for the problem. Look, I think, as I said, I think the solution may not come entirely from within the institutions themselves, because one could argue, perhaps cynically, that there's a lot of self-interest in why you wouldn't want to have these conversations as far as, brand, reputation, etc. So I think a solution comes from having more discussions like this and having a very level-headed and evidence-based approach to, is there actually a problem? And to only assure ourselves that there isn't a problem once we've asked and investigated it, rather than not asking and not investigating it. That's the first thing. Once we understand a bit more precisely the nature of the problem, should it be the way that I've outlined it, is really, I think it will require those external to the university, but to whom the university answers to start intervening. So it might be government, it might be through the tools of funding. We have all kinds of incentives that the government has out there for universities to meet various types of objectives, which of course, a very good thing to do. It'd be interesting to know if there's going to be any appetite in the future for funding to be attached to the environment and a measure of the degree of open inquiry and freedom of intellectual inquiry within institutions. But getting the right people in government to be properly concerned as opposed to overreacting, it also has an element of danger to it. So I'm not sure if there's a clear way forward other than continuing to talk about it, to raise awareness, and to really signal the fact that this is not a right-wing dog whistle. Nearly every single person I quoted, and the others that I flipped through, comes from the left. John Haidt, lifetime Democrat. Lee Jussom. Nearly all of these people are leftists. There is not, I think, a single person that would even be centrist or on the conservative side of any of the people I quoted today. So we need to get past the idea that it's a dog whistle of the right that there's any problem with academia. And we need to be able to convince those who are skeptical outside academia, who perhaps can't see what's going on, that there actually might be something that they need to be concerned about, because I think the long-term impact of what I've described today, if it continues more or less unabated, will be the overall decline in trust in our public institutions, of which the university is already in that declining public institution trust by measures. So it's short-termism of universities that if there is an issue that could eventually lead to a loss of trust in the institution, it's short-termism to avoid doing something about it, because our universities are absolutely critical for our civil society, social discourse. And if they begin to fray around the edges and lose public trust, I think there'll be very serious ramifications for the sector.
Well, I think that that appeal to the social license of universities is actually quite important here. But I guess the a key feature there is who determines what are those the parameters of that social license, and that I think is also a future challenge.
Very much so. And I think amongst all of the discussions going on, which I think are very fruitful regarding the university's accord, for example, and other things like that, I scour those documents to see any reference to what should be the fundamental purpose and mission of a university and its importance in civil society and social cohesion being anchored in a series of commitments to intellectual inquiry. It's like that's taken for granted, and it should be at the core of the argument. And I suspect it's taken a little bit too much for granted, and therefore we're not paying enough attention and nurturing that culture well enough.
And a thought of mine as I was listening, and as you and I've had lots of conversations, and also that that I come from a behavioural psychology background. I do wonder about the how behaviour is functional, but in this regard also, what are the economies that are supporting particular behaviours and ways of behaving especially as we often are operating environments where many of the end users of the knowledge that universities create are interested in they use the evidence of that, and they will talk about evidence-based practice. And I'm concerned about the potential impact there in perhaps some clinical settings, and I'm wondering if you might comment on that.
Yeah, look, I think that's precisely the point. I think the term evidence-based is highly problematic because it's relying on the evidence provided and the evidence sought. And I think it becomes a catch-all for robustness and reliability. But in actual fact, as some of the examples, the case studies and some others that I passed over indicate, there are concerns about what has led to that evidence being presented and curated in a particular way in the first place. And it's not like our politicians or others, end users in industry, non-government sector, whatever, it's not like they've got necessarily the intellectual tools or the ability to challenge or to look inside the black box that is that research that goes on. So I think we should be rightly concerned that when we're presenting as institutions advice to government, to end users of any sort, particularly on the well-being and safety of people and their life quality, we need to be very careful that the evidence presented to inform choices is not already being skewed through a variety of filters that has led to it coming out in the particular way that it has. And the concern I have is in those precise areas where there's the most concern for vulnerability of the communities that the university should serve, they are precisely the areas where I think there's the most egregious ideological distortion of arguments, evidence, and methodology.
Excuse me, Lewis, there's a couple questions in the chat as well.
Okay. Sorry, I'm working from my laptop, and apparently we have some questions in the chat. So Alan, is there an academic cohort undertaking frank and fearless study of the Trump ideology? And if so, what are the results and conclusions?
So can you repeat that?
Is there an academic cohort undertaking frank and fearless study of the Trump ideology? And if so, what are the results and conclusions?
Was that Trump ideology?
Trump ideology, yes.
Right, as in the orange Trump, I'm assuming.
I believe so.
Good question. I do follow the academic and non-academic debates about Trump, and obviously the dangers of having someone like that with that incoherence, inconsistency, and worldview, I think has been widely talked about, certainly in the media. What concerns me regarding Trump ideology is the normal orthodoxy I hear in discussions around the politics of Trump is that Trump has succeeded to the extent that he has because he has a whole lot of racist people in America. He's unburdened their racism, and he succeeded because he basically appeals to the lowest common denominator. And I think, which is not the question, I appreciate that, but this is my understanding of the situation. In looking at Trump's success and looking at some of the more nuanced commentators, they ask, so what was the alternative when Hillary Clinton was there? What is going on with the representativeness of American politics? Who is being represented? How reasonably are they being represented? And in a way, while Trump might be an incredibly dangerous and troubling figure, he may well at least be partly of a symptom of something else that's much more rotten in the American political system. And he's been able to leverage and succeed out of that. So for me, when I hear questions about Trump, I immediately think, yes, but a lot of people still voted for him. And if they're all racists, then that's a lot of racists in America that had previously voted in a black president. So I think the question of what is the appeal of Trump, it's partly self-serving from the media, because let's face it, the New York Times subscriptions went through the roof when Trump became president. He was a headline every day for them. So there's a self-serving element of the liberal media, in a way, economically flourishing under someone like Trump, because there's always something to say. But for me, the much more troubling question is, what is going on in American politics, and perhaps has been going on for some time, that makes such an improbable character as Trump even viable to be, again, a future president? That's deeply concerning for me.
And I think that is a very worthy object of study, and I think not just limited, I think, to Donald Trump's piece, but I think Americans have been asking that question for some time in their politics. Another question, and I think this is actually really quite relevant in putting some local context on your presentation. Is the current review of Australian universities touching on any of the elements you raise? And if so, which ones? Are there any relevant recommendations from you?
Certainly not the current universities accord. No. Obviously, there was some work done under the previous federal government regarding freedom of expression in universities, which I think, again, was a bit of a red herring, because the concern isn't whether do universities have robust freedom of inquiry statements, and thanks to, I think, the French review, they do now. The question isn't, will universities support occasionally high-profile cases of dissenting or controversial people coming onto campus? The concern I have is, under the radar, are universities fundamentally healthy environments for open inquiry and research? And that's actually not addressed by anything I've seen at the moment, because for me, the problem is at least half hidden. And in general, it's probably in universities' self-interest to consider it to be not an issue, because it's something that I think would require a really nuanced and complicated series of discussions to unpick it. And it's not about the odd cancellation. It's about much more, what are the drivers of certain behaviours, incentives within university for not only current scholars, but emerging scholars to do certain types of research with certain types of outcomes of the research pretty much ensured, versus avoiding a plethora of other really important social topics that basically can't be touched. So the self-selection, which is brutally Darwinian in my view, is happening almost under the surface, and that will be a very hard problem to articulate.
Look, excellent answer, and I think that also touches on my previous question about the economies driving these things and where they will go. And we have one more question. So from Suzanne, thank you, Alan. I'm heartened by your suggestion there is a perceptible upward tick seemingly occurring. Where would Australian academia sit on that spectrum? And for their 2 cents, trying to wind itself up in a tunnel.
Where do Australian universities sit? Look, it's hard to know because we don't have the data. A lot of this is from America and a little bit from the UK, where these debates are lively. And because of the critical mass, I think it's easier to find strong voices, the Lee Jussums of the world, the Corey Clarks and others. They're well established, or they're prepared to say things, because there's just a massive scale. So there'll always be people, when there's that kind of number, to put forward something. I think my guess is, and my hope is, Australia isn't in such a bad state as some areas overseas, hopefully, partly due to the funding model and various other things like that, and our reasonably functional democracy and free press, etc. But I think the smallness of the university sector in Australia does make it very vulnerable to dominant ideologies and orthodoxies that are here in the moment. There's simply not the spread of different approaches. There's a very conformist view of how most universities are positioning themselves. They're almost indistinguishable through their strategic plans, what their values are, all that same kind of thing. It all feels much more like a branding exercise rather than a fundamental reiteration of a commitment to inquiry and scholarship. What's really happening, I believe, is that universities are fundamentally committing to only certain types of research and scholarship that they feel is the safe thing to do. And as somebody pointed out, if if all of your supposedly progressive values are the same that you see on a multi-billion-dollar multinational company, you're probably not that progressive after all. And I think universities are beginning to look a little bit like that to me.
Okay. That actually brings us to the end of our questions, unless there are any last ones from people in the audience. And I think that's all that I've seen come through the QAs and the chats. So, Alan, that brings us to now the last part, which is really the vote of thanks for you, which I believe the honour of that falls to me this evening. So, Alan, on behalf of the Royal Society of New South Wales, I really want to thank you for a very thought-provoking, considered talk today that I know has been well received by those online, and that this will be a recorded event as well, so there will be an opportunity for many others to view this and to take on board your provocations, which I think are going to be, I think, quite important for us to consider and how they relate to our individual disciplines that we work in, but also as for myself as an academic leader and as a dean, how I support my junior colleagues in particular to explore those controversial topics that they might be interested in, and to ensure that they feel supported and have the knowledge that both myself and my university support them in their work, even if it might be that they are the victims of some sort of social media backlash, as can happen. And I'm not naive about how these things can visit themselves in universities. So with that, I just would like to say thank you very much for this evening.
Thank you so much, Lewis. And thank you, Susan. And thank you for the Royal Society of New South Wales. It's been a great honour to present to you.
And thank you, Alan. Lewis, thank you for conducting the Q&A. It's my role to close this ordinary general meeting and wish you good night. You really have fulfilled the spirit, Alan, of the Society's tagline, which is enriching lives through knowledge and inquiry. And we do pride ourselves on having the dispassionate debate that you spoke about so eloquently. Lewis, thank you. Alan, once again, on behalf of the Society, thank you. And I close the meeting.